Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Today on the show, my guest is Baum. Is a sacred, intimate, and sex educator based in San Francisco. He has been dubbed a pleasure activist and a warrior of love. Since 2013, he has been teaching his own brand of adult-focused sex education. He leads several Tantra-based workshops across the United States. and I discuss the importance of rediscovering pleasure in everyday life and learning to cultivate deeper awareness of your own pleasure. Shares about his work to help others learn that all pleasures are a virtue. To find and learn about his upcoming classes, visit integral-eros.com. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick.
Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
I wanted to dive right in with some of your identities and ask you, what does it mean to be a sacred, intimate, and a pleasure activist?
For me, the moniker of sacred intimate is one that I took on over a decade ago. And it means that I create safe space for other people to explore and identify and integrate their erotic and sexual experiences in a safe way that has no judgment, that's very sex positive, that gives particularly my clients, but also in some of the group work that I do, an opportunity outside of our normal day-to-day to be in their bodies and play in their bodies and experiment in their bodies. I've found that it is very important work that I love. As far as pleasure activism goes, that is kind of in tandem with, that's a term that was coined by a friend of mine or a colleague of mine. I first heard it from Don Shuey in New York. And he actually wrote a whole article on pleasure activism and how important it is for us to be able to find pleasure in not just in our bodies, but in our experiences in general, and take ownership of that and be okay with not just finding pleasure, but creating it for other people as a means of connection and communication, and finding a foundation within ourselves that we can pull out into the rest of the world that doesn't rely on consumerism or religion or stuff that we're constantly told to project outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And this work that you do is pretty unique. There probably aren't very many people in the world who do this kind of work. And I'm curious, how did you come to start doing this work?
It evolved over time. There actually I think that there are quite a few of us who do this work, but not everybody does it quite in the same way. For some people, it might look or feel a little bit more sexual. My work over time has evolved to be much more integral. I mean, the name of my practice is Integral Eros for a reason, because I really think that if we can integrate this stuff into our lives more, it gives us power to walk more sustainably in the world. So I always say that I have my husband to thank for this work because we met almost 20 years ago, and he was like this sexual rebel to me. He was really comfortable in his body, and he gave me my first massage, and he was just really open about a lot of stuff that I felt super shut down about, having been a 20-year-old in the midst of the AIDS crisis and kind of choosing the path of getting into a monogamous safe sex relationship super, super early. So I was very shut down and closed down about my sexuality and didn't understand it. And he kept saying, go to a body electric. And I put it off and put it off and put it off. And finally
Can you share what Body Electric is for people?
Body Electric is a school that was founded by Joseph Kramer almost 40 years ago now. It was their idea was that in the midst of the AIDS crisis, where everybody was being like super sex phobic and body phobic, teaching men alternative ways to be sexual and touch each other with intention and powerful, ecstatic sexual experiences in their bodies, and be able to like communicate that with each other. So it still remains powerful work, but back in the day, it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, particularly among the gay community. So I went to my first introductory weekend, which is called Celebrating the Body Erotic. I had a very, I don't want to say average, I had a very expected experience where I understood, I think I was more adept at moving energy in my body than some people are. And I didn't understand that until that moment. And I had a much better time offering touch and being the person who worked on other people than I did being the receiver. So I came home, I had these very visceral experiences of feeling super high from the weekends, which is not unusual, but my hands went back and forth between burning and aching because I had moved so much energy that weekend and I hadn't realized what was going on. And shortly after that, luckily, the community for Body Electric was thriving a lot on the East Coast in Boston, where we were living at the time. And I reached out to a couple of people and the facilitator who did my workshop for that weekend. And I said, I don't think I want to be a facilitator, but I do want to offer this work to people. And you mentioned the term sacred intimate, and I'm curious about that. And that was what set the ball rolling. At the time, Body Electric had dismantled some of its programming, so they weren't offering any comprehensive training on that track. But I was super, super fortunate. I'm always grateful to this small circle of very experienced healers and facilitators who offered themselves to me free of charge and said, start doing this work. If you have any questions, come to us and we will support you. So that was how it started. And then a lot of it has been it's been a very unusual way of learning for me. You know, I was raised, as many of us were, in the very traditional Western education model of learning information, having a test taken on it, getting some kind of certification or diploma or validation from outside. And this one of the first experiences that I had where I had a bunch of people saying, go practice and find out what works for you. And be very mindful about the way that you are interacting with other people and the way that you're feeling in your own body while you're working with them. So a lot of it is, I mean, it kind of reminded me when I hear friends talking about going through psychology programs and stuff, there's a lot of like self-reflection that has to happen in order for you to be able to do your work well. So that was probably like the first 5 years was like this learning while working at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that a lot of healing modalities, particularly body work and stuff that has to do with psychology or the mind, you can only learn so much in a classroom or from a book, and you pretty much have to learn just experientially and by doing, and just continuing to refine and be aware and figuring out what works for you and what works for your clients and all of that stuff. So it totally makes sense.
Yes, exactly. And then just to quickly kind of sketch out so that was like the first 5 years that I was working. And then we moved out to the West Coast. And one of the reasons that we moved to San Francisco or decided to move to San Francisco was because this was the birthplace of all of that stuff. And we had had the great good fortune of meeting a handful of people who were in that initial wellspring of information starting the Body Electric, including Joseph Kramer. And then I moved out here and I got to work with him one-on-one for almost a year and a half. And finally, kind of like the tail end that really pushed my work into a whole new level of thinking and feeling about it was working with a handful of teachers up in Seattle who offered a year-long sacred intimacy training through the lens of Tantra. So that gave me this really strong foundation in Tantra that has done nothing but inform my work and kind of taken the pressure off this. I was getting myself wrapped up in this idea, like, here are these people coming to me and I need to pull out all of my magic tricks and heal them. And it wasn't until I did that last training, and that was probably about 4.5 or 5 years ago, that I realized, oh no, this is a conversation. This is a co-creative experience more than I'm allowing it to be.
Mm-hmm. So say more about Tantra, because Tantra is one of those terms that I think is pretty loaded and a lot of people have misconceptions about. So I know it's that's a whole other conversation. But if you could, in a
Right.
nutshell, help our listeners understand what it is and the way that you work with it.
Right. So the way that I understand it, kind of my elevator speech about Tantra, is that it is an ancient philosophy for living authentically in as consciousness inhabiting a physical body. So that's kind of the way that I present it initially. A lot of people, I think, understand Tantra through the Neo-Tantra avenues that it's come to the West, which really focuses on techniques, sexuality, breathing, like all of the ingredients, but what I have found to be none of the meat of none of the core of it. And my experience with Tantra and the way that I use it in my practice is to introduce ideas and concepts that I know to be true to help my clients understand and investigate their situations as human beings a little bit deeper. So, you might come to me for erectile dysfunction and we're going to end up talking about your relationship with food, or how much TV you watch, or how much sleep you're getting, or what kind of phobias and ideas you have about your own physical body, and how much are you listening to it. So
Well, that dovetails a little bit into another topic that I wanted to bring up with you, which is that you have talked a lot about focusing on pleasure as a foundational principle for healing, and especially focusing on pleasure in your everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you work with that, and how do you bring that to your work with your clients?
So particularly this year, the last couple of years have been kind of clunky for me personally. And I made a commitment to myself after doing some really intense practice last December that 2019 was going to be the year that I really bit into focusing on pleasure as the foundation for the year. And when I talk about pleasure, what I find is when I talk about pleasure with most people, they often have a very narrow idea of what that means. It's oftentimes this idea of instant gratification or some circumstance giving me a good feeling, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional. And that's where I find pleasure. When I'm talking about pleasure, I am talking more about investigating a feeling of contentment or deep, I don't want to say bliss, this sounds like a too strong of a word, but contentment or satisfaction or deep release that can come out of investigating every moment. And it can be very subtle. So, for example, I've been looking for pleasure in doing a lot of work that I've had to do on myself this year to kind of get myself to a point where I've been intending to go, which means I've had to look at my movement practices. I've had to look at all of the stuff that I'm taking into my body, food, liquids, media, interactions with other people. How much time am I actually spending either by myself, moving, taking things in, or moving through this urban environment that we live in? What else?
Have there been particular places where you were surprised by the pleasure that you found?
Yes. At the beginning of the year, my diet was really out of balance. And I have been doing a lot of really hard work focusing on paying attention to my body. And when something goes in it, either taking a moment before I eat something to check in with my body and really feel into the physical reaction that's happening there. Is it welcoming? Is it feeling like I'm pushing something away? And then after eating, noticing, how is my digestion feeling right now? Is my body feeling energized or lethargic? Am I feeling light and ready to go? Am I feeling like I want to go take a nap and be lazy? Am I feeling sick to my stomach? All of these different little cues that tell me, and it all has to do with pleasure. Am I moving towards pleasure in this food experiment, or is it my mind fooling me into thinking, oh, this is going to be great? Because for many of us, food is tied into emotional and mental ideas of what pleasure is. So when I'm practicing it myself and when I'm talking to my clients, I'm really talking about this deep, sustained pleasure that carries us to the next moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of what you're talking about sounds similar to what I talk about with some of my clients, which is the difference between happiness and joy. A lot of people come in to therapy and counseling and they say, I just want to be happy. I'm unhappy. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. And I talk to them a little bit about that, about their experiences of happiness, and challenge them to think about joy. And some people, that's a new idea for them. And the way I think about it, especially on the energetic level, is happiness is this short burst of high energy that doesn't last for very long, usually, which is, I think, a lot of what people are wanting when they are suffering in some way, which is why they may turn to some kind of habit or addiction, because it's able to bring them relief or perceived happiness temporarily, but it doesn't last for very long. Whereas joy may not be such high level energy, but it's more sustainable over time, I think. And I think that it can take practice and awareness. So I really, as you're talking about this, I'm equating pleasure with joy.
Yeah, it's the same idea at the end of the day. Pleasure and joy can be equated in the same way. And for me, there's a correlation between the way I experience pleasure personally and my ability to connect with other people. And it's a tricky thing to work with most people, I find, because we're not taught in our culture that taking pleasure for yourself is a virtue. It oftentimes we're oftentimes shamed or told that we're being selfish if we're looking for pleasure. And that's not, a lot of times when I'm working with couples, the first thing that I'll do is have them each individually write out a list of desires for themselves, because it's a lot of times particularly in relationships, we're not taught to put ourselves first. We're taught to always be looking at that other person and what do they want. And if they're not telling me what they want, then it's my job to read their minds and figure it out. It never really works very well.
Yeah, and I think that selfishness has got a little bit of a bad rap. Mm-hmm. And it trains people to not be focused on themselves. And then when they don't get what they need or what they want, they get upset, mm-hmm. right? Instead of being a little bit more selfish or self-centered, not in a way that is all-consuming and completely unaware of what's happening with other people around them, but really looking at, well, what are my needs and what are my wants and what are my desires and how can I get that and how can I communicate that? Instead of, as you said, expecting someone to read my mind, because if I say what I want, then they might think I'm selfish.
Right. And we have this weird relationship with selfishness and self-care, similar to the way that what I've been finding is the more that I'm working with this pleasure principle as a foundation, that we have a similar relationship with selfishness and self-care that we do with our relationship to sex and the body, where self-care is one thing, but don't be selfish about it. And you can't do both. You can't be practicing self-care and not on some level be selfish. So what I'm finding is it melts people's brains. Like they short circuit when they're trying to figure it out. They're like, I don't understand. I'm trying to do all this good stuff for myself, but then I don't want to be selfish. And sometimes I say, well, why not? Why not be a little selfish? Wouldn't it be much better if you were able to speak your desire or speak what you needed in a moment, the person or the people that you're interacting with, and then let them respond however skillfully they can, than continually having this dance of I'm making an assumption about you, you're making an assumption about me, and we're missing the mark. Even if it's just slightly, those things are exponential. And we often find, like, where did this resentment come from? Or where did this cord come from? Or agreement drift come from? Well, you're not communicating with one another.
What are some of the stories you hear from people about why it's not okay to be selfish?
Because they equate selfishness with greed, and they equate selfishness with inequality, I think. And there really is this notion of virtue in giving of yourself to other people or giving of yourself to other organizations or charities or whatever. And or what many people don't understand, I think, is that you can only give what you have. And if your battery is empty and you're still giving, you're running at a deficit all the time. And that's one of the really challenging things that for most people to understand, I think, is that if I'm feeling depleted, that is a flashing red light telling me to stop doing whatever it is I'm doing and take care of myself or be a little bit more selfish. I think particularly from a capitalist mindset, which all of us have because we live in a capitalist culture, selfishness is equated with more to the detriment of somebody else.
So TT, something else that you do is you teach workshops to help people get more in touch with their sexuality and their pleasure. And I imagine that some of what we've just been talking about is really helpful to people in those workshops. So I wonder if you could share more about that.
Sure. So over the last couple of years, I've been developing this umbrella called the Intimacy Academy that encompasses all of the group work that I do with people. The most immediate and regular offering that I have for groups is called Queer Touch Ritual. And it is an opportunity for us to explore as a group, in a group setting, our own individual desire, our own pleasure from the standpoint of the physical body and from a place of touch, and then negotiate offering and consent and trying to find pleasure or intending to find pleasure, not only in the act of receiving, which can be really hard for people, particularly if we're not speaking directly about what we want, and also in the act of giving. Where's the pleasure in the act of giving? So one of the things that you'll often hear me say if you come to a touch ritual is, if you are a receiver in a pair or a group and something doesn't feel right to you, or something isn't meeting exactly what your idea of what you want it is, you're invited wholeheartedly to give feedback to the people or the person who is giving you touch. And by the same token, if you are somebody who is giving in that moment, and you find a lot of times when we're giving to somebody else or when we're offering something to somebody else, we're not 100% present in the moment. Our minds will drift off, we'll lose focus, we'll get distracted by something across the room or something outside. And the invitation for somebody who's giving in that moment is to call their attention back. What can I do to make this interaction interesting for me? So the call is really, how do I find deep pleasure on both sides of this moment? And what can I do to make my request as a receiver playful for the person who's giving to me? And how do I, as a giver, meet that play and that curiosity and that adventure in a way that shows that I listened really deeply to that person's desire and I'm willing to show up with my full self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really helping people learn how to be fully engaged in their pleasure, whether they are giving or receiving, and being in touch with what's happening with themselves while also being in touch with what's happening with their partner at the same time.
Yeah, it can be very challenging for people because it's often such a black and white thing. But I think at the end of the day, my intention for those play shops, they're really short. They're only like 3 hours. They're not weekend long things, and they happen on a regular basis. But my intention is to give people a foundation of communicating while they're engaging in touch with each other, because that's another thing that I think we're not trained in. We're shown and we're modeled all these behaviors about how talking and negotiating and discussing and doing a little bit of work when we're being physically playful with one another is a no. You'll ruin the mood. What happens if I don't ruin the mood and I tell you what I want and then you meet me there and we all get our needs met and we have an amazing time?
Yeah, I mean, we see so many images in media and TV and movies with people having sex or being sexual, and most of the time there's hardly any talking at all. And it just seems to be happening so perfect and seamlessly. And so I think that's part of where we get this idea of like, well, it's just going to happen. And you should know exactly what I want and exactly what to do and to read my mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate you bringing that education forward to help people have more joy and pleasure.
Yay, thank you. It's my pleasure, actually. I love doing those.
So TT, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Oh, only one.
You could share two if you like.
I will say, honestly, moving to San Francisco and really sinking my teeth into the experience of living here and sucking the juice out of everything that was available to me when I landed here has really helped my queer spirit to flourish in ways that I never thought possible. I look back now at the way some of the ideas that I had about queerness, identifying as queer, offering those ideas to other people, my sex positivity, my ideas about gender and sexuality. And they were so different and shut down and very binary and black and white when I first moved to the West Coast. And my journey here has been as much about expanding my ideas of what it means to be a human being, queer human being, as it's been about moving to the West Coast and having the experience of quote unquote living in San Francisco, whatever that means. So really that was a game changer for me in ways that I never could have anticipated. And I will be forever grateful. I go to other parts of the country and other countries and realize what a gift it is to live in this. What I said to a friend of mine is like the hotbed or the cutting edge of ideas and discussions and experiences around gender, sexuality, race, class, all of it. And it's just this amazing soup that we get to swim in here.
So TT, where can people find out more about you and your work and your offerings?
I have a website. It's www.integral-eros.com. Pretty much if you Google TT Baum, that will come up right away. You can find me on Twitter at Integral Eros, all one word, and also on Instagram under my name, TT Baum. And any of those avenues will give you a little better sense of what I do and the work that I do in the world, and more information about how to get in touch with me.
And you travel fairly often teaching and working, correct?
Yes, primarily the workshop stuff mostly happens on the East Coast. I have a pretty good relationship with some places in New York. So I go out there probably twice a year. I'm up in Seattle a lot, 3 or 4 times a year, because that's where my teachers live. And I have a pretty good situation up there, a handful of clients who I see on a regular basis. I'll also be going to Texas soon, Chicago this year sometime, and I can't even remember where else. So,
do you ever go overseas?
I haven't for quite a long time. I'm exploring. I just came back from Mexico. I'm exploring some opportunities to go down to Mexico City or over to the coast in Felipe and teach down there. So I'm in conversation with some people who I know who live down there, just to see what's what.
Great. Well, I just wanted to let our listeners know, wherever they may be, that they might be able to, that you might be in a city near them soon.
Oh, yeah.
So
I'm always, the best way to find out about that is to look on the calendar on my website.
Great. Well, thank you for being here and sharing about your work.
Thank you.
I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.